Well, good evening and good morning, depending on where you're joining us from. We are here for the Calder Center Conference's session on Hope or Hype, hacking through the role of tech in refugee protection. Before I get started properly this evening, I'd just like to make a couple of Zoom housekeeping points. This is going to be a 40-minute session, moderated discussion with our distinguished panel. There will be time afterwards for audience questions. Now, you can submit these questions at any time through the Q&A tab, and you can vote on questions there if you like. We'll try to get as many of them as possible into the discussion, and immediately following this panel, there will be an opportunity for interactive discussion in a breakout session. There you'll be able to turn on your cameras and microphones and engage in a bigger discussion. That breakout session will take place in a separate Zoom meeting. And you'll find the link in the chat and you can click through at the end of the session. So to make the most of our 40 minutes, I'm just going to share a couple of thoughts and then we'll launch straight in with the panel. I was reminded in preparation for this evening's session that it's of the New York Declaration that came 4 years ago. Now, as some of you may have noticed, there's been an election in the United States, something that also happened 4 years ago. Back then, the New York Declaration was a real kind of high watermark for a moment where refugee resettlement seemed to be rising right across much of the Western world. Private sector was seen as having a new and vigorous role to play in what was a very optimistic and kind of technologically friendly period in the refugee landscape, at least. Coming forward 4 years, we've just had an election once again in the US, and things seem markedly different. If that period in 2016 was marked by thoughts about how tech and private sector could play a role in everything from refugee protection to matching algorithms for refugee resettlement, somewhat more skeptical thoughts dominate the landscape. Now there are questions around algorithms and discrimination. There are international organizations are facing a much more skeptical view of their collaboration with big tech companies, from Microsoft through to data miners like Palantir. On our panel this evening, I'm very pleased to have with us Tay El Rayula, who is joining us, I think, from the Netherlands. And Tay is the author of The Invisible Sun, a new book that's come out this year. Tay has hands-on experience as an entrepreneur and a practitioner and miner of a Bitcoin miner and a practitioner in blockchain. I'm going to come to Tay first, and I'll introduce our panelists as we go through these questions. Tay, if I could take you back 4 years, and you'll accept my premise that there was a real surge of optimism around what tech could offer to refugee protection in 2016. What do you feel that you've learned during the intervening 4 years, and how do you feel about terms like tech for good now in 2020?
Well, I believe technology has played a very important role in the journey of refugees, at least to Europe, since the early days when asylum seekers started choosing Europe as a destination. They relied on technology to plan their trip, specifically Facebook, communication platforms like WhatsApp, Facebook Messenger, helped to communicate the journey among groups It helped to spread the message of safe routes. Yeah, I want to call it FAQs, frequently asked questions on a trip to Europe. Where does the boat leave from Egypt, for example? At what time? What's the prices they're gonna pay to take a dinghy or a rubber boat and cross to Greece? So this is from a very we see it as a public and more common among refugees. But there was something that we did not witness before, which is refugees going to online platforms to continue their education and to study. And I am one of those people who chose to study online. And I pursued my master's in digital currencies and blockchain technology. But we're seeing now others going to other platforms, for example, let's say Coursera, where they can continue their education. And in 2020, we all became somehow refugees, sitting confined to our own homes. We're not allowed to go outside. We communicate with our families similar to how refugees communicate through WhatsApp, through the screen, through Facebook. And the number one thing that was as well common between the refugees and what we're living now in 2020 is the online education. So for me personally, this, they call it a brave new world, or that's, hey, this is something new. But for refugees, it has been always the case of trying to leverage anything you have, including technology, to enhance your environment and to create something good out of it. So I am one of the you know supporters of that slogan, and I lived it personally as well. That technology can be used for good.
I'd like to turn next to Petra Molnar. Petra is a lawyer and researcher. She heads a new initiative called the Migration Tech Monitor, and is also one of the directors of the Refugee Law Laboratory. Petra, your work focuses on a different aspect of the interaction of technology and borders and refugee protection. Could I ask you to assess how technology, or how you see technology interacting with the kinds of journeys that Tay has just been describing coming forward to today, so in 2020?
Thank you, Daniel, and thank you for having me with you today. Yes, my work takes a slightly different approach, and we basically are trying to unpack some of the sharper edges of the technological development that occurs in migration management. By this, I mean the rise of surveillance technology, the rise of automation, and how it's impacting people's rights. And definitely, I would say over the last 4 years, it's been a marked rise in a variety of different technological experiments that we've been seeing in a variety of different migration ecosystems, borders, different corridors that people are crossing. And I think for me, when I reflect on how the situation has been changing and the types of technological interventions that we're seeing, I always try and remind myself that it's important to remember that none of this occurs in a vacuum, and that we need to understand the kind of broader ecosystem in which these technologies develop, which priorities count, and the increasing worrying rise of the kind of big tech private sector companies that are increasingly calling the shots when it comes to this kind of tech development. Because really, we're seeing an increase of anti-migrant sentiment, xenophobia, criminalization of migration, and the rise of what some people have called the border industrial complex. And now also with the pandemic, this kind of idea around biosurveillance that's ushering new tech interventions in the time of COVID, precisely because pandemic responses are always political and they map onto particular ways that certain communities are made marginalized. So I think this is such an important way of trying to unpack these issues, looking at it from a political perspective, but also a historical perspective, like you said, Daniel, within the last 4 years, but also perhaps even more of a deeper history, because certain communities and certain bodies are the ones on which these tech experiments are rolled out on. And if anything, I think as time goes on and as we are facing these increasing challenges, this kind of panopticon of migration technology is only going to get worse. At least that is something that we're trying to track at the Migration and Tech Monitor. Because it's right now, this kind of surveillance, automation, whether you call it algorithmic decision-making or AI type technologies, we're seeing it impact every part of a person's journey. Before the border with big data and social media scraping, at the border with things like drones and unpiloted surveillance equipment, and even beyond the border when we're talking about automated decision-making in immigration applications, or even outlandish new projects like AI lie detectors. So really, I think, if anything, this kind of surveillance and control over particular communities that we've been seeing historically is getting exacerbated, both in the last 4 years, with the rise of the Trump era, but also with the pandemic now. And the concern is that this kind of structural power imbalance is only going to get worse.
Thank you, Petra. I'd like to bring in Roya Baghdad. Roya is the founder and director of Taraz, a research and advocacy organization working at the intersection of technology and human rights. Roya comes from a slightly different background to some of the academics I've come across certainly in the migration space, in so much as you were an electrical engineer at Advanced Micro Devices and come into the human rights sphere from a sharply technological background. Roya, you've spoken of the need for a Hippocratic oath for technologists working in the humanitarian field. Could I ask you to explain a little bit what you mean by that, and also reflect, if I could ask you to also on this idea of where we're at now with a sense of tech being only for good in the refugee space.
Sure, thanks, Daniel, and hello, everyone. Yes, I'm so glad that you brought up New York's declaration, because I remember about 3 years ago, I wrote a paper and I started with New York Declaration and shared responsibility. And when I read my paper again, I think that in some way that I was a little bit naive, and I want to correct myself now, because we are reflecting on what we wrote and what we perceived. So one thing about the shared responsibility, at the moment, I was thinking that it's all about partnership between big tech companies, big humanitarian organizations. All of them, they should be on the same page when they want to create or design a technology and when they want to deploy that. As a result, there was some kind of like recommendation that, oh, UNHCR should work with Microsoft, but both of them, they should hold each other to account, but they have to be on the same page and create a technology that it can be used in different settings and in different geographies or a different situation. That was kind of my perception of partnership, shared responsibilities. But now that I look back, I think about the designers and developers that they were involved in creating those technologies, I think we kind of overlooked community-focused and community-based and more decentralized way of creating technologies, that maybe something it's going to only serve 20 people or 50 people and might not be applied for the UNHCR to be used for every settings. Maybe some of those community technologies or entrepreneurs among refugees themselves, they can work with a smaller humanitarian organization with open source communities and create a technology that it's not necessarily scalable. At the moment, I was thinking about, like, in humanitarian tech, we need that type of scalability. Because everybody talked about, like, everyone is responsible for that. And I was thinking, okay, big tech and big humanitarian organizations are the one. I'm not saying that they should not be responsible and accountable, but the way that I think about technologies these days and how they are designed and developed is a more grassroots, more community focused and more decentralized. This is one, to answer your second question. For your first question, yes, because I myself, I was an engineer, and I realized during the time that I was involved in designing and developing technologies, I didn't see the societal impact, political impacts of technologies, because of my education was in a way that it didn't help me to understand these kinds of societal impacts. As a result, I left my job and I went back to school to study human rights, because I think as engineers, as scientists, as developers, programmers, we also have responsibility to think about the impact of our work. That doesn't mean that we know all the answers, but at least there should be some kind of understanding about societal impact, about human rights impact, and how we, during the time that we want to think about certain ideas to solve certain issues, we also have to think about the short-term, long-term impact of that, to avoid all those tech solutionist ideas that it came up specifically in 2016, 2015. That is what I mean by Hippocratic oaths for technologies that they work on humanitarian technologies.
Thank you, Roya. I'd like to turn next to Fleur Johns. Fleur is the professor in the Faculty of Law at UNSW in Sydney. She will, in the coming year, be the Australian Research Council Future Fellow, visiting professor at the University of Gothenburg in Sweden, and is at work on data science and humanitarianism under a grant from the Australian Research Council. Fleur, we've had a little bit of, some of the broader kind of categories have been touched upon here. But I'd like, if I could, to get you to talk about the trends in the use of big data by humanitarian actors, and more specifically, given that we're doing this at the Calder Center, I'd like you to talk about as well what challenges that presents from a legal perspective.
Thank you, Daniel, and hello everyone. Good morning where I am. So yes, the broader trends, you're right, I think, Daniel, to focus on this intensification of enthusiasm about the promise of digital tech in the last 4 years. But it's worthwhile noting that it goes back quite some time. I mean, from memory, the use of biometric registration for refugees for resettlement support, accessing resettlement support, was instituted at the Afghan-Pakistan border from about 2006, 2007. So it's actually been creeping in, not necessarily, that sounds very malevolent, but it's been growing as a trend for a long time. But I think that you are right, over the last few years, it's become increasingly the first reflex response when people talk about the intensification of demand upon humanitarian actors, given the predictions made by the IPCC about climate change and the growing frequency and intensification of disasters and displacement, and the current and emerging chance of violent conflict over scarce resources. So it's becoming the reflex, the go-to, when people talk about the need for real-time data, the need for more granular data, particularly on communities that have been previously not well seen by the infrastructure of refugee protection. Another broad trend is that this meshes very well with the way governments are increasingly look to understand and account for their mainstream populations. There's a growing turn to various big data sources and techniques, data science techniques, in official statistics by governments, and the UN Stats Commission has a working group on that. So governments around the world, not just in relation to refugees, but in relation to their mainstream populations, are looking to use satellite image data, mobile phone data, supermarket scanner data, to some extent social media data. So this is part of a broader trend. And another broad characteristic of this is the layering of this protective infrastructure and these initiatives upon a pre-existing infrastructure which was primarily built for profit. And I'm talking about a software infrastructure, a lot of the basic elements of the software, but also the hardware infrastructure, things like server farms, undersea cables, are dominated by for-profit players and have been predominantly designed in their basic terms with a profit-making objective. So you had a refugee protection regime devised in the aftermath of the Second World War that was more or less purpose-built. Obviously, contracting out has been a long-term trend in that, but it's not as though there were never for-profit players working in that space, but it was more or less purpose-built. And now you've got that protective regime's operations increasingly rooted through an architecture that was built for quite different purposes. And that has that is not without costs and risks. So to take me to the second part of your question, let me just highlight a few key risks and challenges. One is the way in which this transforms the sort of transactions and interactions at work. So if you think about an asylum seeker making a claim upon a host state or an international organisation, that's really a moment of an assertion of a political identity and a moment of reconnecting with a polity, with a community, a political and social community and economic community. And so it's a really important moment how we frame those moments of political identity formation. And things like biometric registration of refugees really transform the way we practice that. And again, I'm generalizing here, there's a lot of different ways that one can do it, but the tendency is to treat the refugee as a passive, inert body emitting data rather than conducting that as a dialogical process when one is registering using biometric data. So it's a fast, smooth, relatively smooth and designed to be seamless transaction that is not really a dialogical one. It's very much a one-way one. The body emits data, the data is read, and on we go. So that's, I think, not insignificant, the way we change the way refugees interact with states and international organisations. A second key challenge is the way in which it relates to this point I made earlier about the kind of rerouting of refugee protection through for-profit architectures. It tends to get enmeshed with other agendas and other objectives. And that's not necessarily problematic in every instance, but it does raise concerns. So it tends to get enmeshed in agendas of financial inclusion, including microfinance and so on. And again, that's not necessarily problematic in itself. Access to finance and access to banking for the very poor is a very pressing and real concern. But it does raise difficulties if the possibility of opting out of, say, debt relations is not available to refugees. So this kind of meshing of agendas in ways that are not always easy to pull apart or for the refugee to grasp and understand and potentially opt out of, that is a major challenge. And the third one I would sort of, I would point to is one about which a lot of people have been talking and writing in recent years, which is all the questions around error and bias and vulnerability to breach. So digital identity management, for instance, often presents, as many people have observed, as quite an opaque and unquestionable process. And so invariably there are not just risks, but actualities of error and bias in these things, and they can be very difficult for a refugee or an asylum seeker or persons supporting the asylum seekers and refugees to access and interrogate and question in a meaningful way.
Thank you, Fern. We'll be coming back to some of those points in the time that remains. Tay, I'd like to come to you next. We began the discussion with your observations on the grassroots adaptation of tech by people who are on the move. But you've also spent significant time writing, thinking, working on the possibilities of using blockchain to create resilient portable identities. And obviously a lot of hope has been invested in the idea that the blockchain might open the way to different modes of financial inclusion for different categories, from asylum seekers to long-term refugees. A lot of optimistic work has been built on some of those assumptions. Could you talk us through, I mean, starting just with your best description of what is blockchain and how can it meet the identity challenge that many people who have moved through forced migration or internal displacement face?
Sure. I mean, I'm happy that Fleur touched upon the points of biometrics and identity management. And I mean, historically speaking, identity management as a piece of technology, it was used to automate killing and to automate death. And here I'm referring to the World War II event where the Nazis, under the leadership of Adolf Hitler, were using the identity management systems. Actually, it was one system in Europe, the punch card machine, that was, or that is, a piece of an IBM technology at that time. So the Nazis were able to go down in the roots of the families through the identity management system, the punch card machine, and identify where are the Jewish bloodlines. Now, this is somehow more or less happening today, but in a biometric sense, where we collect face images of refugees, asylum seekers, vulnerable populations, and we store them in those siloed data centers. And when you ask an NGO, how are you protecting your data? In general, their answer is, we have bank-grade security. I'm not sure if an NGO must have a bank-grade security for identity management systems, or is it their job in the first place to preserve and protect data? Or is it something that they need to learn now and they need to adapt to the digital world we're living in? That being said, the vulnerability here, or the chance of error, somehow is equal to death. And there were incidents in the Netherlands where Iranian scientists and Iranian opposition leaders were assassinated inside the Netherlands through the Iranian regime, simply because their addresses and their data was leaked. The Rohingya crisis is another example of how can, or what is the imagination of, what is the consequences of leaking data on refugee populations, asylum seeker populations, and vulnerable populations in general. So this is, I think, a very sensitive and very important topic, and I don't think we can give it an hour to discuss. This huge research and huge amount of resources is going into this topic, specifically here in Europe. Now, what happened is, in the refugee crisis that we are witnessing now, I will not label them, but I will call them people. People are fed up. People are they're hopeless, and people have been living in plastic tents with a UNHCR label since 6, 7, 8 years. No hope, no future, nothing, just living in the void. And they're looking for an answer, but they're not getting it from governments, from NGOs. They're getting it from somewhere else. They're getting them from the tech communities. So, as a personal experience, 2 years in refugee camps in the Netherlands, when we wanted to have access to money, we were denied, because simply we don't have papers, we don't exist. But who embraced us? It was the tech community that embraced a large number of refugees. It is the Facebook pages, it is the WhatsApp groups, it is the Telegram groups. And when it came to money and financial inclusion, it was the Bitcoin groups. Now, this is a very important moment to consider in time when refugees are banked using fintech and using technology that is open, that is borderless, that is neutral, that's distributed. And whether you apply it in identity or you apply it in money, the consequences and the implications are huge. Suddenly, we don't have to wait for permissions. Suddenly, we can take decisions by ourselves. We can be self-sovereign. We can be self-sufficient. Is it happening now at a very shy scale? But it is happening. It is happening that we are seeing in different refugee camps. There is adoption of technology. There is adoption of blockchain. And what is blockchain? Simply, it's a tech. It's a tool. It's a tool that anyone can use around the world. It's a tool that works on your smartphone, on your internet connection. This is the basic requirements for it to give you financial access, to give you access to borrowing money, lending money, saving money, carrying money, and options to store your documents, store your private information in a safe and secure manner. There is a huge gap between where refugees are today, where asylum seekers are today, where policy thinkers and policymakers think refugees and asylum seekers are, and this gap is somehow, closing down by using tech, but it is permissionless tech. You don't need to take permission to be part of this network or this community, and that's the beauty of it.
Thank you, Tay. Petra, if I could come to you, you spoke a little bit before about the power imbalances that determine what the potential uses of tech are, both for the individual who's on the move and for migration, for governments and others who are attempting migration control. You've talked and written recently about borders and areas of mobility as testing grounds. Could you explain a little bit what you mean by that, and why that means that the migration space in particular is worthy of study and understanding potential hazards of tech?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Daniel. You're referring to a report that we just released last week on essentially trying to understand why certain spaces become testing grounds or high-risk laboratories of tech experimentation. And it's interesting because for me, I'm a newcomer to the digital rights and tech space. I'm an immigration lawyer by training, and as someone who's been working with communities that are made marginalized, that oftentimes don't have access to justice, don't have access to recourse, it was kind of interesting to try and figure out why particular tech is being rolled out in particular spaces. And again, it maps onto the way that power is distributed, the way that the ability to participate in conversations around innovation is distributed. And spaces that are on the margins, areas like different corridors where people are, of course, migrating, areas where there's already very limited oversight and where the decision-making that happens is discretionary and opaque. It really makes the perfect kind of laboratory for experimentation. And unfortunately, it's also sometimes just very difficult to know what is going on, both by the population that is living through it and is being impacted by it, but also, for those of us who are trying to understand how this all maps on to the very little governance and regulation that exists. And I do think this is deliberate. I think there is a deliberate obfuscation around what is happening and how this technology is playing out on the daily, particularly because it's allowed to proliferate in spaces where accountability is virtually non-existent. And unfortunately, in the European context, but also in the Australian context, we've been seeing policies of border externalization or pushing borders further away from their physical location become a normalized policy. And unfortunately, once again, I think this kind of decision-making on part of policymakers and states and state sovereignty type conversations is only going to get worse. Just recently in September, the European Union released its new migration pact. And for those of you who are interested, it's worth a read, but it's also not surprising because this pact really stitches this all together quite nicely. There's a renewed focus on border enforcement, really clear messaging around surveillance and the expansion of powers of entities like Frontex, which is the agency that basically polices Europe's borders. And again, this kind of framing around which communities are on the margins and therefore able to be kind of tested or experimented upon. And one of the concerns is, of course, that while people on the move, refugees, asylum seekers have very particular vulnerabilities, particularly when it comes to data breaches and sharing, like Tay was mentioning, the concern is that this is becoming so normalized that we as a society are going to be facing these types of issues as the years go on. So really, while we're now seeing this kind of experimentation or this testing ground occur in particular areas where discretionary decision-making already happens, concern is that this is going to be so normalized that it will become kind of part and parcel of our daily lives, as automation is already increasing basically in a variety of ways that you as an individual might be interacting with the public state entity and others. And for those of you who are interested, I'll put a link to the report in the chat if you want to give it a read.
Thank you, Petra. It's sobering thoughts. Roy, I'm going to turn to you in the hope of some slightly more optimistic thoughts on a potential role for a more humane and ethical artificial intelligence in this space. Is that how do you see that playing out, and what can we do to push things in that direction?
Sure, thank you. I have one very simple, short answer, and the other one is a longer and more important answer. But in terms of using the technologies specifically in machine learning and algorithmic decision-making systems, there have been groups that they have been thinking about the issues of fairness, accountability, and transparency, how certain technologies perpetuate racial and gender bias and how it can be addressed. There are groups that are working on AI explainability and interpretability, that those works are interesting too. But I think the question and then the report that Petra, she wrote that I really liked, it challenges the issue of power and why these technologies are used from the beginning. So that is something that it might be a more important question, and we have to find a better answer for that question. And I think when you think about technology, there are ways to design them in a way that is more human-centric. So there are groups that they work in human-computer interaction, that they are trying to think about participatory design methods. They are thinking about value-sensitive design methods. These are very academic theoretical thinking, that how, in order to design and develop a technology, we have to involve the community. But how we can translate those theoretical fields of the study, such as participatory design, value-sensitive design, human-centered design, into actual practice, I think this is something that humanitarian organizations, civil society organizations, communities themselves, they can help. Because at the moment, these kinds of ideas are very much into theories. So this is something that I am very much looking forward to think how we can apply these theories in the situation of refugees. The other thing that I can think about is about using these technologies to address the causes of migration. Because at the moment, when we talk about technologies, we always want to have a short answer or short-term impacts, how we can streamline application process, asylum seeking process, housing resettlement. But then there are technologies that it can be used in order to think about the causes of being a refugee or migration. One of those areas that we can think about is just, we all know that climate change has a direct impact on causing refugee crisis. Why not using satellite imagery to understand how deforestation or climate change, it might impact refugee crisis, or it might trigger a refugee crisis? Or how can we use these kinds of technology in order to understand political unrest in certain countries that it might cause kind of refugees issues? So I think as scholars or practitioners or researchers that work in humanitarian technologies, we have to think not only about all the short-term fixes, but also about causes of these issues and how to apply technologies in those settings too.
And I'm keen to get to some of the questions that we have coming in through the Q&A. But Fleur, I wanted to turn to you for a slightly unfair request, which is just a kind of a lightning response to the issue of how legal scholars can contribute to trying to reclaim this notion of there being positive contribution from tech. I mean, how do you see, what would you see as being key to a legal scholar's response in trying to shape a positive outcome for tech interventions in this space?
Sure. Well, to focus on the issue of accountability, which is uppermost in mind for legal scholars typically, I think this interface between digital tech and the market logics with which it's often been developed, and refugee protection regimes and their logics, often leads legal scholars to think about accountability in a number of ways. What we might think of as exit or voice. So the consumer protection idea that the consumer can go elsewhere, exit, or they can complain, voice. Or in a more traditionally legal way, a focus on review and reasoning. So reasoning out, explaining the reasoning, and focusing on the particular disputes, so particular instances where things go wrong. And I think all those have their limits. So exit is difficult. For an asylum seeker, you can't just shop around for refugee protection. Voice is difficult for a range of reasons that we're very familiar with. This audience will be very familiar with. And review and explainability and focusing upon instances of bad things happening really doesn't get to the important issues that both Roya and Petra have raised, and also Tay have raised. So I think we need to think about other areas of accountability that we have tools for, and thinking and elsewhere in our repertoire. So we can think about things like participatory budgeting. So that getting into the earlier stages of the allocation of resources to tech development and procurement of particular, contracting out to particular companies or actors, that we can think about possible accountability mechanisms and participation mechanisms, which are well established, and there's a good repertoire of tools for those, but that attach at that earlier stage, so that organisations like UNHCR could potentially look to things like participatory budgeting to get their constituents, asylum seekers and the broader constituency of the refugee, of organisations like UNHCR, involved in these very early and impactful decisions about where you allocate money and who you get involved in design and development. It can't rest on a customer service, and it can't rest on good intentions, because we know from history that lots of bad things happen with the best of intentions.
Definitely true, and thank you for such a swift but wide-ranging answer to that. I'm going to turn to a question for Petra that's coming from Tamara Wood. She's asking whether the impact of technology on migration and policy is mainly quantitative, i.e. it exacerbates the impact and reach of already existing discrimination, as Petra mentioned, or is technology making a more fundamental difference to the way that migration is managed or controlled? And I think I'll ask that question of Petra, but I might also come back to you, Fleur, to ask what good governance ambition in this is. But Petra, if I could start with you, is this actually shaping behavior of people who want to be on the move? How do you see, how would you answer tomorrow?
Thanks, Daniel, and thanks, Tamara, for your question. I mean, I think it's both. It definitely exacerbates what's already existing, the structural problems, discrimination, xenophobia that we're seeing. But I think you're right. I mean, it also is impacting and fundamentally changing how we imagine migration control to look like, both from the perspective of the kind of top-down surveillance state sovereignty approach, but also from the way that, you know, populations and people on the move might be thinking of changing their own behavior and their own, for example, migration journeys. But I think the problem is that, again, this is very much kind of a free-for-all space where it's difficult to know where, from at least from the surveillance perspective, you know, how things are developing and moving forward, which I think, again, goes back to this kind of exacerbation of this kind of space of discretion, of opaque decision-making, of a free-for-all in these kind of frontier spaces that is normalizing this kind of oftentimes violent, harmful use of technology. And I think that that's my biggest concern with all of this, is just how very quickly states and powerful entities have become used to using the kind of sharp edges of this technology against the populations that we work with or identify with, and how normalized it is, and how it's really changing and shaping the contours of what migration really looks like. Because it's also changing maybe the way that we conceptualize ideas around the border. I mean, these days, this can be your border. An iPhone or a cell phone very much is linked to your identity, your experience, the way you interact with the state or with the UNHCR, or even under COVID, the way that your population, your movement is tracked rather. And so I think the idea around the border as an idea itself changing and becoming embodied both within ourselves, but within our personal technology is something that we need to think about as well.
Actually, in order to address as many questions as possible, there's an interesting question coming from Graham Tom from Amnesty. He cites the example of Australia government's recent attempt to remove mobile phones from those in detention. And I think it's a good question for you, Tay. Have we reached the point where we should think of access to technology as being a human right, and whether it can be protected? I'll start with Tay and then perhaps come to you, Fleur, for your thoughts on the legal aspect of that. But Tay, human right?
Yeah, I think access to a smartphone and internet connection is a basic human right as shelter, education, and anything else. And unfortunately, it's not only in Australia that you know, the government wants to take out smartphones in camps. The first thing that you do as a refugee in the Netherlands or as an asylum seeker in the Netherlands, because later you become a refugee, you have to give your smartphone to the police so that they can check the content, and then through Facebook channels, asylum seekers communicate that, hey, if you're coming to a refugee camp, hide your smartphone, hide your cell phone. So why I'm saying this is, Daniel, no matter how they enforce rules and they enforce regulations and they try to limit the movement of refugees and try to limit the freedom that we want and we came for, we will always find ways to defeat that. There's always a loophole that we can exploit and you know, and use technology for our benefit.
Thanks, Tay. And I'd also think that's partially an answer to Regina Jeffries, who was asking about the way in which technology can often define itself by being used to circumvent or there's government control. But is there any theoretical framework, Flo, that you can see in which access to technology can be could be defined as a human right?
Yes, I'd agree with Tay. I don't actually think you need to think in terms of developing a new right. I think the way we have come to interact with these devices and depend upon this medium of communication means that it is, I think, a natural extension of quite conventional ways of thinking about freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, and also bodily integrity. I mean, there's been some interesting work that looks at the way in which the biome of the body, so the microbial existence of the body, actually includes devices that we maintain this intimacy with. So the microbes on our phone are actually part of our bodily biome, it can be argued. So this intimate dependence upon these devices, which is problematic for a range of reasons, means that they're essential to the way in which we connect with communities, both near and far, and essential really to bodily integrity as much as freedom of expression, freedom of assembly. So I think we don't need to think, and it wouldn't be strategically advisable to think in terms of arguing for a new human right. I think we need to extend our theorisation and interpretation of traditional rights and just demonstrate, as is quite easy to do, I think, that these traditional rights now require access to technology and, of course, electricity and other basic infrastructure that supports that technology. So it isn't all the whiz-bang stuff, it's also the basics.
I appreciate that. I'd like to come to you, Roy, because you promised a short answer, but sketched out that there might be a much longer, more detailed answer. And the question has come back from Daniel Gazelbash, who's asking how we reclaim the technology for good agenda, and referencing the notion of the Hippocratic Oath, just asking for other strategies that can be adopted to ensure that tech innovation promotes and furthers refugee and migrant interests. Right, you spoke a little bit about ways in which this could be done theoretically inside design processes, but I'd like to give you a little bit of space to expand on that, because I was being very controlling with the time previously. So if you'd like to address Daniel's point.
Sure, thank you for the question. About reclaiming tech for good, honestly, I came to this point that I think we shouldn't think about tech for good, we should think about responsible technology. And when we think about responsible technologies and design, then you can use the tech for any reasons, including for humanitarian purposes. So in terms of Hippocratic Oath, I want to say that technologists, designers, developers, they have responsibilities, but that doesn't mean all the accountability and responsibility on them in terms of like holding to account. Speaking of New York Declaration and shared responsibility, Hippocratic Oath, or learning how to design in a way that it's not violating anybody's rights is one of the responsibility, but it doesn't minimize the legal responsibilities of governments, private sector, and humanitarian organization. But to answer the question, to expand on what I think about the design, one simple answer, it could be the notion of privacy by design, right? So if you are a technologist that you want to build an app, think about what are the principles of privacy by design: pseudonymization, anonymization, collecting data to the purpose that it's required for your certain technology, not beyond that. These are some of the principles that they can use, right? So, or when you think about participatory design, what does that mean? Does that mean only just doing participatory design, meaning that involving community in the design and developing of your project? Does that mean just doing 10 people interview and then based on that feedback you build your tool and that's it and call it participatory design? No, that's not. It means that from the level of ideation to piloting, to testing, to deployment, have the community being involved in the project. The reason that I said it's theoretical and it's very hard to implement, because when you think about the issues about refugees, specifically about the short-term fixes or answers, the issue of urgency comes up, then you think, oh, how can we have a sustainable community engagement through the ideation all the way to design and deployment? And that's why I think we as the scholars or researchers and practitioners, we have to think about how to apply these theories. And there is another, just to be very specific, there is a very good book, it's called Value Sensitive Design by Betaya Friedman, that it sketches out 13 methods in order how to think about designing technologies, that it's more based on values. It specifically talk about human rights and privacy, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly too. It's not specific for refugees and humanitarian contexts, but I think it's good for us to think about these methods and how it can be applied in designing technologies. I can go further about deployment and maintenance of technology too, because it's something that it's not talked in our field, maintenance and sustainability of technology. We always talk about designing a deployment and not about maintenance, but I know that I have to be aware of the time that we have. But that is something that I would like us and also audience think about, how maintaining these technologies when they are used and how to sustain them, as opposed to just thinking about design and deployment.
I'd like to finish this evening just by going to the panelists one by one and asking for a very brief, preferably about 30 or 40-second thoughts that you'd like to leave the audience with this evening on this issue of hope or hype around tech and refugee protection. It can either be a relatively positive thought, and we'll call that a hope, or a skeptical thought that's deflating somewhat the hype. Petra, you're always optimistic. I'll pose that question for you first.
I am always optimistic, but unfortunately in this space, my optimism is wavering a bit, because I think the kind of big tech hype and techno solutionism is still very much part and parcel of the conversation, but this kind of, band-aid solution on these complex, intractable social problems is really not the answer. I think what is the answer is thinking through meaningful participation with communities with lived experience, asking ourselves bigger questions. What kind of world do we want to live in, and whose perspectives and priorities count?
Fleur, could I come to you for your very quick thought?
Yeah, so my natural inclination is to cut down the hype and focus on the skepticism. So perhaps I'll work against that and try and be a little hopeful. If we think of this, our concerns about digital technology in refugee protection as a set of a larger set of concerns around the way in which digital technology's ubiquity is transforming our social and political and economic relations and our legal relations as well, then that enables us to look at all sorts of practices that are actually quite exciting and interesting that don't necessarily relate to the refugee space. So communities like K-pop fans messing with surveillance applications that were developed around Black Lives Matter and things like that. There's interesting ways in which various communities around the world are devising interventions in this incredibly, sometimes oppressive seeming and impregnable architecture. They're devising interventions that really problematize and mess with them, but also create a community and create connections that wouldn't otherwise be possible. So I think if we look at all those practices and look in unlikely places for those practices, we can find inspiration and hope, and also friendship among those communities that can be the basis for political innovation and legal innovation going forward.
Hey, hope or hype?
No, I definitely choose for hope. And the reason is, refugees and asylum seekers cannot wait for politicians and cannot wait for policymakers to bring the change and bring the promise of technology and other things like shelter, education, and medicine to our communities. So part of being a refugee and asylum seeker is the resilience you have in you to leave everything behind and come for a new start. The same way that we're able to use that resilience in our daily lives, we will and continue to use resilient technologies in order to achieve what we want to achieve, whether communicate to our loved ones back home, transact online, open a shop online, study online. We are aware we're being monitored. We are aware we're being watched. So we always try to choose the best that suits our current situation. And, just on a very light note, if it wasn't for the pandemic, I wouldn't be with you here today, because most probably this conference would have been taking place in a physical location in Australia. As a Syrian and as an asylum and a refugee seeker, I'm not allowed to enter Australia. So, the good side of the pandemic is it forced you guys to make an online stage. And that online stage gave me the chance to share my voice with you. So that's the examples of, yes, technology can bring hope.
Well, that's also helping me to come to a natural conclusion here. I'd like to thank the conveners of this evening for me and this morning for many of you, this conference at the Calder Center. I'd like to thank our very thoughtful panel, and appreciate the questions that were also brought up for us here. And I look forward to these conversations continuing in a multitude of different forums that we're all present in. But thank you very much for your time, for your thoughts, and for your questions as well. And that's all from us on the panel. Thank you.